Yo, what is up guys? Delboy here, aka Blue Collar Sports TV. Hopefully you guys are doing well. If you're new here, smash that like button, hit subscribe, all of that good stuff. So the PBC and Showtime Boxing have announced their upcoming fights, their upcoming schedule, and I've got to say, this schedule as a whole is pretty damn solid, especially considering what's going on right now, post-pandemic, all of that nonsense. Certainly the strongest schedule announced post-pandemic. So credit to the PBC and Showtime, they've really come out swinging with this announcement, and I've got to say, it's really relieving to actually talk about boxing again, talking about real fights. It's fucking relieving, and I'm so pleased, I've got to say. But anyway, let's take a dive into this schedule. August 1st, you have Stephen Fulton Jr. versus Angelo Leo. That fight is essentially a battle between two unbeaten young fighters, and they will be competing for the vacant WBO Super Bantamweight title. I've got to say, this fight on paper is very competitive. Both guys young, both guys unbeaten. I've seen a bit of both fighters. I've seen more of Stephen Fulton. I think I've actually only seen one of Angelo Leo's fights, and that was his fight against Cesar Juarez. He actually won that fight by stoppage, and he looked pretty good for the most part. He looks like a pretty solid fighter, as does Stephen Fulton. When you get two young unbeaten guys going at it, especially for a title, it can result in some really fun fights. So to me, that's a great start to the schedule. Two unbeaten, young, evenly matched fighters on paper. On August 15th, you've got David Benavidez making a defence of his WBC super middleweight title. He will be fighting Roma Angulo. Now this fight is arguably the weakest on the schedule, but you know, compared to what we've had recently from Top Rank, Frank Warren, and what we've coming up with Eddie Hearn, this isn't a terrible fight. David Benavidez himself, very exciting fighter, power, hand speed, big for the weight, he's aggressive, throws combinations, he's always good fun to watch. And Roma Angulo, for what it's worth, he's actually fought for a world title before. He fought Gilberto Ramirez, went the distance, had a couple of good moments in that fight, and in his last fight, Roma Angulo actually beat the highly touted Anthony Sims Jr., so he is going into that fight with a bit of form. He can punch a bit. So despite this actually being one of the weaker fights on this schedule, in my opinion, it's not terrible. It's not the worst fight I've ever seen on paper, you know? So I've not really got a big problem with David Benavidez versus Roma Angulo. On September 19th, you've got a super welterweight battle between Erickson Lubin and Terrell Gausha. Again, I think that's a pretty good crossroads fight, to be honest. Erickson Lubin, still quite young. He's had one shot at a title, famously got knocked out in one round by Jamel Charlo. He's basically on the comeback trail. And Terrell Gausha, he himself has fought for a world title, lost to Erislandy Lara. This fight essentially will show you who's ready to contend for a title again and who isn't. I think stylistically this could be a pretty decent fight. I do expect Erickson Lubin to come through this. I think he's the more talented fighter. I think he's got the higher upside. But in my opinion, a pretty good test for Erickson Lubin. Arguably, this is the sort of fight he should have been having before he fought Jamel Charlo a couple of years ago. But you know, Erickson Lubin versus Terrell Gausha, a perfectly good fight in my opinion. Now on September 26th, we've got a pay-per-view doubleheader. Jamel Charlo versus Sergey Derevyanchenko, great fight. And Jamel Charlo versus Jason Rosario, that's another great fight. That's also a unification fight at super welterweight. That, in my opinion, is a great card. A great card. I've actually done separate videos for those two fights, so you can check those out on my channel. But all in all, that is a great card. Is it pay-per-view worthy in the States? That's not for me to say. I don't have to pay for it. I'm going to get this card for free, I'd imagine, or on network TV, whatever you want to call it. That card, man. That card. Give it to me now. Super excited. Excellent fights. Credit to the Charlo brothers. Credit to Derevyanchenko. Credit to Rosario. Excellent card. Got my seal of approval. October 10th, you've got Sergey Lipinets versus Quadratilo Abdukakarov. That is a IBF final eliminator, I believe, or an interim title fight, something like that. But that's another evenly matched fight. Lipinets, as we know, he's a former super lightweight champion, a pretty entertaining fighter. He's aggressive. He hits hard, and all round, Lipinets is just a fun fighter to watch. He's a pretty solid contender in my opinion. And as for Abdukakarov, I've seen a bit of Abdukakarov. He is a pretty smooth technical boxer, doesn't carry the most power, but he's technically sound, he does the basics well, and I think that fight between Lipinets and Abdukakarov will be very competitive and pleasing on the eye. I think that's a really sort of back and forth 50-50 type fight. I am kind of leaning towards Lipinets, I have to say, but a really good fight, a competitive fight. October 24th, on Showtime pay-per-view, you have Gervonta Tank Davis versus Leo Santa Cruz. Now, from what I've read online, and I'm not sure whether this has been confirmed or not, apparently this fight between Tank Davis and Leo Santa Cruz is actually at super featherweight, so 130 pounds. If that is true, that actually makes this fight a bit better. When they was first talking about this fight, they was talking about lightweight, and in my opinion, that was just too much for Leo Santa Cruz. I really don't see Leo Santa Cruz as a lightweight, to be honest. And even at super featherweight, I think he's kind of maxed out, to be honest. In his last fight in that division, he looked pretty poor. So Tank Davis versus Leo Santa Cruz, am I that hyped about it now? I've got to be honest, not really. Something about this fight has just never done it for me, I've got to say. Maybe it's my belief that Leo Santa Cruz is not the same fighter above featherweight. Maybe it's that, but at the end of the day, not the worst fight in the world. I will certainly tune in, no doubt about it. And yeah, maybe the closer this fight gets, maybe I'll get more excited, I've got to say. Maybe it's going to be one of those fights that creeps up on you, and on fight week you actually look forward to it. Maybe it's one of those, but right now I have to say, while I don't think it's a terrible fight or even a bad fight, it's just not one of those fights that really grabs me, I've got to be honest. On November 28th, you've also got Chris Colbert versus Jamie Arbeloda. That fight will be for the interim WBA super featherweight title. Not a bad fight. I've seen a lot more of Chris Colbert than I have Jamie Arbeloda, to be honest. But Chris Colbert to me looks like a decent young fighter. I'm not all that sold on him, I've got to be honest, but he looks fairly decent. The only fight I've seen of Arbeloda was his fight against Jason Velez, and that was actually quite competitive, so I expect Chris Colbert to win this fight, to be honest, and I expect him to win it quite comfortably. You know, looking at this schedule, maybe that fight is actually the weakest on this schedule. But anyway, we'll move forwards to December 12th, and what a fight this is. What a fight this is. Nordine Oubaali versus Nonito Donaire. December 12th, this is a WBC bantamweight title fight. Excellent fight. As we know, Nordine Oubaali is the WBC champion. He's a very aggressive fighter who fights with like an offbeat rhythm. He's kind of hard to time, he's hard to read, he's a really aggressive, awkward fighter and very effective, whereas as we know, Nonito Donaire is an elite level counter-puncher with serious punching power in that left hook and that right hand. Nonito Donaire, in the last sort of 18 months or so, has really had an Indian summer in his career. In his last fight, he gave Naoya Inoue hell, and he did a lot better than most people were expecting. But in that fight, he did take a lot of punishment, and he is now a year older. I think Donaire is now 36, 37 years old. By the time this fight comes around, he would have been out of a ring for a year, and maybe Inoue beat what was left out of Donaire. So Donaire potentially might not be the same fighter on December 12th than what he was November last year against Inoue, but still on paper a really good fight. And if Donaire can get back to that level in which he fought Inoue, he's got a great chance of beating Nordine Oubaali. Like I said, Oubaali's a guy who likes to rush in. He's kind of awkward when he does it. But if Donaire can catch him with that left hook and use Oubaali's momentum against him, he's got a great chance to knock Oubaali out. That is a great fight. An aggressive swarming fighter versus a counterpuncher like Donaire. I think that's going to spell for fireworks, to be honest. I really do. All in all, I've got to say, credit to the PBC, credit to Showtime, credit to Al Heyman. This is what it's all about, good fights. And this schedule as a whole is pretty damn solid in my opinion. It's without doubt the best schedule post-coronavirus, no doubt about it. And one more thing to consider, I think there's a good chance you're going to get more announcements from the PBC. I'm sure they still have TV dates on Fox to announce, so the likes of Errol Spence, maybe Manny Pacquiao, Keith Thurman, Sean Porter, Danny Garcia, potentially these guys could be fighting on Fox. So maybe there's even more good fights coming from the PBC. You know, if they could get their welterweight sorted out in some good fights, the PBC will actually be in a really good position in the second half of 2020 because their schedule, especially if they get their welterweight sorted, would be low-key fire. So there we go. I like the schedule. I'm really happy with it. Share your thoughts below. Peace.